The day I almost died, I was carrying a gift for my daughter-in-law. It was a snow globe, one of those cheesy tourist ones from a shop near my hotel in Chicago. Inside was a tiny skyline, and when you shook it, the fake snow swirled around the little plastic buildings like a blizzard that never went anywhere. My wife Margaret would have loved it. She collected them. We had 37 on the shelf above the fireplace before she passed. I bought it without thinking, the way you do when grief hasn't fully caught up with your hands yet. My hands just reached out and picked it up, and the woman at the register smiled at me, and I paid, and I walked out into the January cold with a snow globe in a paper bag and no one to give it to. That was the morning of January 14th. My flight home was at 11:40. I remember everything about that morning with a kind of sharpness that still unsettles me. The smell of the terminal, the way my rolling suitcase kept pulling left, the coffee I bought that was too hot to drink. You remember things that way when you almost don't make it back. My name is Walter. I'm 67 years old. I worked 31 years as a civil engineer for the county, raised 2 kids, mostly on my own after Margaret got sick the first time, and I have never in my life considered myself a man who needed rescuing. I fixed things. I was the one people called. My daughter called me when her furnace broke. My son called me when he needed a co-signer on his first car loan. Even after Margaret died, 18 months before all of this happened, I kept being the one who showed up with tools and casseroles and quiet stubbornness. I want you to understand that about me, because what happened at O'Hare International Airport on January 14th doesn't make sense unless you understand what kind of man I thought I was. My son's name is Derek. He was 38 at the time. He had his mother's eyes and my worst habit, which is that he never asked for help until the situation was already a disaster. He called me in November, 2 months before the Chicago trip, and told me his contracting business was struggling. The housing market had slowed, he said. A couple of big clients had pulled out. He needed a short-term loan just to cover payroll through the winter, and he'd pay me back by spring. I gave him $60,000. I didn't blink. I didn't ask for paperwork or a payment schedule or any of the things a sensible person would ask for. He was my son. Margaret would have done the same thing without even asking me first. What I didn't know then was that $60,000 wasn't the plan. It was just the beginning of the plan. The Chicago trip was Derek's idea. He said I needed to get out of the house, which was true. He said I'd been isolating since Margaret died, which was also true. He said his friend had a corporate suite at a hotel downtown and wasn't using it that week, and that we could watch the Bears game and eat deep dish pizza and walk around the city the way we used to when he was a kid, and we'd take weekend trips, just the 2 of us. He made it sound like something Margaret would have arranged. He knew exactly how to frame it. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son, and I was lonely, and sometimes a man just wants to watch football with his kid. We had a good time. I want to say that clearly, because it matters. We had 2 genuinely good days. We ate too much, laughed about things that happened 20 years ago, walked along the lakefront in the cold until our ears ached. Derek seemed relaxed in a way he hadn't been in months. I thought the loan had relieved some pressure. I thought we were getting back to something. On the last morning, we packed up and took a ride share to O'Hare. Derek was quieter than usual in the car, but I figured he was tired. I was tired too. We checked in at the counter, went through security, and found our gate. We had about 40 minutes before boarding. Derek went to get us coffee. I sat with the bags and pulled out my phone to check the weather back home in Columbus. That's when the man sat down next to me. He didn't look like anything remarkable. Medium height, dark jacket, maybe 50 years old. He had a lanyard around his neck with an airport ID badge, but he'd flipped it backwards so I couldn't read it. He sat close enough that it felt deliberate, but not so close that anyone watching would notice. He leaned slightly toward me, the way you do when the terminal is loud and you don't want to raise your voice. He said, "Sir, I need you to stay calm and not react to what I'm about to tell you." I looked at him. I thought he was going to ask me something strange. Directions, a phone charger. I said, "All right." He said, "My name is Agent Carver. I work in federal security for this airport. I'm going to ask you to trust me for the next few minutes, and I know that's a big ask from a stranger." He paused. "We've been watching your travel companion since yesterday morning. I can't tell you everything right now, but I need you to come with me, and I need it to look like I'm detaining you." I felt something cold move through my chest that had nothing to do with the January air outside. I said, "My son is getting coffee." He said, "I know. We have people with him. He's fine. You're fine. But I need you to stand up slowly and follow me. And if anyone asks, including your son, you look confused and a little embarrassed, like you've been pulled aside for a random check. Can you do that?" I wanted to ask 100 questions. I wanted to tell him he had the wrong person, the wrong family. My son was getting us coffee. We were going home. But something in the way he said it, the quietness of it, the steadiness, made me stand up. He put one hand on my arm gently, the way you'd guide someone who'd stumbled. We walked away from the gate, around a corner, and through a door I'd never noticed before. It opened into a narrow corridor with fluorescent lights and no windows. There were 2 other people waiting, a woman in plain clothes who introduced herself only as Diana, and a younger man who didn't introduce himself at all. There was a folding table with a laptop and what looked like audio equipment. Agent Carver shut the door. He said, "Mr. Walter, your son Derek has been in contact with a man named Pollard. We've been monitoring Pollard for an unrelated investigation for about 4 months. 6 weeks ago, your son's name came up in a conversation. We started paying attention. I said, 'I don't know anyone named Pollard.' He said, 'Your son does. Pollard has a background in pharmaceuticals, specifically in compounds that are difficult to detect in standard toxicology panels. He and your son had 4 phone calls between November and January. The last one was 3 days ago. The room felt like it was getting smaller." Diana slid a photograph across the table. It was grainy, the way surveillance photos always are, but I could see Derek's face clearly enough. He was sitting across from a man I didn't recognize in what looked like a diner. They were both leaning over the table. I said, "That doesn't mean anything." Agent Carver looked at me carefully. He said, "Mr. Walter, we intercepted a package delivered to your son's car 2 days ago. We had it tested. It contained a slow-acting compound, odorless, colorless. It would cause what looks like sudden cardiac failure within 4 to 6 hours of ingestion." He paused again. "We believe it was meant for you. We don't yet know the delivery method." I heard those words. I understood them. And then I sat down because my legs decided they were done standing. Margaret always said I was too stubborn to fall apart in front of people. She was right. I sat in that folding chair and I breathed, and I didn't fall apart. I just became very, very quiet. I said, "My coffee." Diana was already on her radio. What I didn't tell them, what I couldn't bring myself to say out loud in that room, was that I had been carrying a thermos that morning, an old plaid one that Margaret had packed for road trips for years. I brought it on the trip because it was one of those habits I hadn't broken yet, filling it up with coffee from the hotel room, carrying it around. And Derek had asked to borrow it the night before, after the hotel restaurant had run out of the dark roast he liked. He'd used it, washed it out, handed it back. I told Diana about the thermos. The younger man took it out of my bag without touching the outside, used a cloth, handled it carefully, and left the room. I don't know what they found. They never told me the specifics, and I stopped asking eventually because some things you find out you can't unknow. What they asked me to do next was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, harder than sitting beside Margaret in that hospital room, harder than giving her eulogy in front of 300 people while my hands shook. They asked me to go back out there and act normal. Agent Carver explained it. They needed more, needed Derek to say something incriminating on record, because the phone calls and the photograph and even the package weren't enough on their own to make a solid case. They needed me to go back to the gate, drink the coffee Derek had brought me. They would have someone swap it out before I ever got near it, and have a conversation, ask about the business, ask about the loan, let Derek talk. They wired me up in about 4 minutes. The younger man knew what he was doing. I asked Agent Carver what happened if Derek figured it out. He said, "We have 7 people in that terminal right now. Nothing is going to happen to you." I said, "That's not what I asked." He looked at me. He said, "He won't figure it out." I thought about my son's face at the lakefront 2 days earlier, the way he'd laughed at something I said, genuinely laughed, head back, the way he did as a little kid. I thought about Margaret's snow globe collection above the fireplace and how I had one more now that I still hadn't decided what to do with. I walked back out into the terminal. Derek was at the gate. He had 2 paper cups, and he looked up when he saw me and said, "There you are. They tell you your bag needed extra screening or something?" I said, "Something like that. You know how it is." He handed me the cup. I held it. Diana had already mowed the switch somewhere between the corridor and the gate. I never saw how. I never asked. But I held that cup, and I thought about 38 years of my son's life, and I drank from it. Derek said, "So, I was thinking, when we get back, we should sit down and go over some of the business paperwork, just so you're in the loop, since you're technically a stakeholder now." I said, "Sure. What kind of paperwork?" He said, "Just the loan documentation, formalize it a little. And actually, there's a small revision to the operating agreement I wanted to run by you, just administrative stuff." I said, "What kind of revision?" He talked for about 4 minutes. He talked about partial ownership transfer, about liability protections, about how it was actually better for my estate planning if certain assets were in his name rather than mine. He talked the way he used to talk as a teenager when he wanted something, smooth, fast, layered. Under any other circumstances, I might have listened and nodded and said I'd look it over. That's what I would have done 6 months ago, a year ago. Any version of me before that corridor with the fluorescent lights. Instead, I said, "Derek, do you need more money? Beyond the 60? He hesitated, just for a second. He said, "It's not about the money, Dad. It's about structuring things correctly." I said, "Okay." And then we sat there at gate H14 in the ordinary noise of a busy airport, and we waited for our flight to board, and I talked to my son like everything was fine, and somewhere in that terminal there were 7 people watching us, and I have never felt so alone in my life. They arrested him at the jet bridge. I was 3 people ahead of him in the boarding line. I heard him say, "What? What is this?" And I turned around, and there were 2 agents with badges out, and Derek was looking past them, looking for me. And when he found my face, his expression did something I can't fully describe. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was more like a door closing. Agent Carver appeared beside me. He said quietly, "You can keep walking. There's a seat reserved for you. We'll need a statement when you land, and there will be someone from our Columbus field office to meet you." I said, "He's my son." He said, "I know." I said, he has 2 kids, my grandchildren." He said, "I know, Mr. Walter." I didn't keep walking. I stood there until Derek was out of sight, until the jet bridge door was just a door again, and the line was moving, and the gate agent was looking at me with a practiced kind of concern. The flight home took an hour and 40 minutes. I held the snow globe in my lap the whole way because I'd put it in my carry-on, and I didn't have anything else to do with my hands. The fake snow settled at the bottom. I shook it once and watched it swirl. The investigation took 8 months. I won't go through all of it. The depositions, the calls with attorneys, the day I had to tell my daughter-in-law what her husband had done while she sat at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea like she was trying to stay warm. She had known something was wrong. She hadn't known how wrong. Derek was sentenced to 11 years. I revised my will 6 weeks after the arrest, not out of anger, or not only out of anger, out of clarity. Margaret had always said I was too sentimental about money, that I confused love with giving people things. She was right, the way she was right about most things. I set up a trust for my grandchildren that they can access when they turn 25. I made my daughter the executor. I donated a significant portion to a foundation that supports elderly adults who've been victims of financial exploitation, because apparently that's a category of thing that happens enough that there are foundations for it. I still have the snow globe. It's on the shelf above the fireplace, between a ceramic lighthouse Margaret bought in Maine and a glass orb from a Christmas market she dragged me to in Cincinnati the year before she got sick. 38 snow globes now. I keep telling myself I'll stop buying them. Some people ask me if I've forgiven my son. It's a fair question. I think about it more than I expected to. The answer I've arrived at, after a lot of quiet mornings with a cup of coffee and that shelf of snow globes, is this: I love him the way you love someone whose actions you can no longer make sense of. The love doesn't disappear. It just stands in a room with something that broke it. And the 2 things look at each other and nobody moves. Margaret used to say that a family is not just the people who share your blood. It's the people who, when everything goes wrong, are still standing near you. Agent Carver was a stranger. Diana was a stranger. That flight attendant who brought me water without me asking, who looked at my face and understood something was wrong, she was a stranger. I think about that often, and I think about the moment Derek handed me that cup of coffee at Gate H14. I think about the fact that he looked me in the eye when he did it. I don't know what he was thinking in that moment. I've stopped trying to figure it out, because there is no version of the answer that makes me feel better. What I do know is this: the person who saved my life that morning did it quietly, without making a scene, by trusting a 67-year-old stranger with the truth. He didn't have to. He could have handled it without me. He chose to let me know what was happening because he believed I had the right to. I've been thinking about that kind of decency for 18 months now, thinking about how rare it is and how little we talk about it, how a stranger can see your life more clearly than the people in it sometimes, how love, real love, the kind that doesn't want anything from you, tends to come from the quietest places. I'm still in Columbus. I still drink my coffee from that old plaid thermos. I still go to the hardware store on Saturday mornings the way I have for 30 years, and I still come home to a house that is too big and too quiet. And I sit in the chair by the window where Margaret used to read, and sometimes I think I can still hear her. She would have known something was wrong, I think. She always did. She would have said, "Walter, pay attention. I'm paying attention now." If you're listening to this and you have a feeling something isn't right in your family, in your finances, in a relationship that feels like it's slowly asking you for more than it should, pay attention to that feeling. Not with fear, with clarity. The way that agent sat down next to a stranger in a busy airport and told him the truth. That's all this is, really. Someone sitting down next to you and telling you the truth. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if something in this story touched you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're thinking. I read everyone.